You've entered Bookstorm with Kristen Civiletto and me, Chris Storm. This is a podcast devoted to best-selling books that matter, books that make a difference. We're diving down deep with beloved authors about their stories. We're exposing hot-button topics and heartfelt themes, the issues that affect each of us in our own lives, as siblings, parents, partners, friends, as human beings. We're braving new ideas, fresh thoughts, hard lessons, and important truths. Those kinds of things that stay with us long after we turn the last page and close the book. Well, welcome back to Bookstorm Podcast, Fiction Lovers. We have something very special for you today. You know, we vet each book that we receive. We only choose those that we love. And we have a book and an author here today that we adore. Welcome, Alex Hay.
Thank you so much for having me and for those warm words of introduction.
And in case you haven't noticed, Alex is calling and speaking to us from London. We're thrilled to be talking to him from there. We're here to talk about his debut novel called The Housekeepers. Kristen and I were thrilled to receive this book ahead of time. We read it and we adored it. But I have to tell you a little bit about Alex. He grew up in London, Cambridge, and Cardiff. He studied history at the University of York and later worked in magazine publishing. He has always been a voracious reader, and he has been writing since he was 6 years old, short novels in his exercise books. And we're so glad you have. He lives in Southeast London with his husband, and this book is not only a debut, but it was called the best anticipated book of the summer of 2023 by Good Housekeeping, Harper's Bazaar, Washington Post, Reader's Digest. It was the July 23 Indie Next Pick. Wow, Alex. Book List says it's full of shocking secrets, suspense, hidden identities, flamboyant characters, and subtle humor. Publishers Weekly says it is a glittering debut. The lighthearted romp is a treat, and Bookstorm Podcast could not agree more. We cannot wait to dive down into this story.
Oh my goodness, first of all, thank you so much for that lovely summary of all those deliciously kind things that people have said. You've reminded me just what a dream of a year this has been. So thank you for that. How exciting.
It's a dream of a year because it's very hard earned and well deserved, and it's all true. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, of course, Alex, we're here to talk about The Housekeepers. And I like to give our listeners a summary of what's going on in the book without giving away spoilers. And of course, I would love for you to add anything at the end if you would like. But in your story, right out of the gate, we meet Mrs. King. She is a housekeeper in Edwardian London. Now, Mrs. King is no ordinary housekeeper. She was born into a world of con artists and thieves, and she's made a respectable living running a beautiful grand home in exclusive Mayfair. Now, this home is packed with art, with silver, with all kinds of treasures, and it's really a symbol of a lot of things, including wealth and power. Now, there's some dark secrets in this house, and of course, they unravel as the story progresses. Now, Mrs. King is suddenly finding herself in need of a new position, and she is thinking about revenge. She gathers together a group of women to maybe help settle some scores. These are a very interesting group of women. Just very briefly, I'm going to touch on them. We have a black market entrepreneur, I'm going to call her, an actress who is desperate for the part of a lifetime. We have a seamstress who is dreaming of a better life. And of course, we have Mrs. King's predecessor at this grand home. And maybe she also is nursing a desire for revenge. Now, these women come together in a plan that I'm not going to say too much. I'll let you give some details if you'd like. But they are anticipating an incredible ball that's going to be held at this grand home. And their plan for revenge is going to play out against that backdrop. What would you like to add, if anything?
Well, first of all, what a wonderful synopsis of the story. And you've reminded me of just how much I loved writing it, hearing you talk through some of my beloved characters. I think that was brilliant. So The Housekeepers is a historical heist. So that delicious, dastardly plan at the heart of the story is very much at the heart of the plot as well. So in a nutshell, it's big hats, big houses, bad men, brilliant women. And if you think the Oceans franchise meets Downton Abbey, then there you have it.
I love that. I think I saw in the book too a line I just wanted to read. One should never underestimate the women downstairs. What
Quite
an
right.
intriguing line. I love it. Well, that's wonderful. If you're ready to brave the storm, I think Chris will kick us off.
I have to say to our readers, um, it is a historical mystery. It is fun. It makes you think. You discover something of yourself. I just adored every second, every single solitary page. It's witty, quirky, juicy, fun. I loved all these women. Mrs. King, Mrs. Bone, Winnie, Alice, Hepzibah, and even the two Janes. I love the fact that there's two Janes. It took a lot of cunning and a little luck to attempt to succeed in such an impossible heist. And I had to ask you, as the writer, what led these characters forward despite the setbacks and the doubts? Was it just pure revenge, just to pay off their debts, or maybe something a little more? Maybe they needed to achieve something of significance. Maybe they wanted to be someone they had never been allowed to be.
That is such an astute question. And I will tell you, when I wrote the first draft of The Housekeepers, it was quite a straightforward robbery story. So the desire to nab as much delicious treasure as my gang could from that house was probably the driving motivation. And at the end of the first draft, it felt a bit thin. It felt a bit lackluster, and actually going a bit closer to the bone on each of those characters and unpeeling their motivations in the course of the rewriting process, I certainly discovered that actually treasure is all very well, but there is certainly an internal drive and desire that is pushing each of my gang forward. And I'm sort of stuck because I can't say too much without revealing a great deal. But I think in your question, you asked about whether or not a desire for, I suppose, fulfilling your potential and getting the most of life, whether that was a driving factor, and it was. And this is a story set in a time when people were increasingly thinking about how to reorder their existence, with new technologies rising and falling, new fortunes being made left, right, and centre. And there was an opportunity for my cast in particular to think through how could they rebuild their lives in a direction that felt right, and how could they right some of the wrongs that they saw around them, and what was the personal reason that each of them needed to see change in that house on Park Lane. So finding the pathway for each of them and finding what those locks that needed to be unlocked in their hearts were was really delicious detective work for me as the writer. And actually it took several goes with some of them in particular to try and get there. But by the time I was writing the final pass, and indeed writing the final pages, it was a very special feeling knowing that for some of them in particular, things had come both literally and emotionally home.
And you know what we loved especially, Alex, that because this is historical, the women then had little or few rights. And crossing that over in today's day and age, for any minority who is stopped from becoming who they're allowed to be because of prejudices and small minds, I would guess that if you spoke to any of us, we might say throughout our lives, we had to get creative to be able to be who we were meant to be. We had to think outside the box and do some things that were unusual in order to achieve. And so it spoke a wonderful message to all minorities as well.
Well, I love that question, and thank you for saying that. I mean, have we not all at times in our lives felt jaded and constrained and compressed? Certainly those feelings are uppermost in the minds of my characters. The reason I loved writing my protagonist, Mrs. King, who, as you said, is a cool-headed, sharp-witted, entirely capable housekeeper to a particularly impressive mansion. The reason I adored writing her was because she has a certain level of audacity and gumption and resilience and a courage to look at the world around her and, to steal your phrase, get creative and think through what's a reimagination of that suits her best. And that was incredibly thrilling for me to write. So I started this book in the summer of 2020. Here in London, we had just come out of the first big lockdown. And life felt pretty bleak, to be candid with you. Work was tough, life was tough, the world was scary. And the opportunity to dive into Mrs. King's head in particular, and with a certain level of ruthlessness, reorder her world, was incredibly enticing to me. I suppose it was real wish fulfillment for me as a writer. So I think no matter what your starting point for picking up this book, I hope if you've felt irritated on the smallest level or deeply unhappy on the biggest level, you can find something in Mrs. King and their gang to perhaps just inspire those moments of getting your just desserts.
Loved it so. Thank you.
Absolutely. Now, Alex, without giving away spoilers, I know you mentioned it's hard. It is hard in the story. I really loved the underlying theme of corruption. And you kind of explored that in a couple different ways. First of all, Mrs. King believes that, and here's a quote from your story: corruption started on the surface of the skin, dirt in the fingernails, nicks and cuts, flesh bubbling, hardening over. It needed to be treated quickly with carbolic and gauze before the rot could set in. And I wanted to ask you, what did Mrs. King mean? And don't we all have to get our fingernails dirty just a little bit?
She asks such good questions. I love that question. So you don't have to do too much reading about the 1900s in London to realize pretty quickly that not all that glitters is gold. And if you scratch on the surface, you find corruption existing not far beneath it pretty rapidly. And so it went in this story too. So for all the power and privilege and opulence that this house on Park Lane in Mayfair represents, there were at the time more nefarious forces shimmering in the background. And so they are shimmering in the background of this house too. Mrs. King is talking about the fact that under all those glorious surfaces, there is this reality. And if you don't do something about it, if you don't reorder that world, then corruption spreads. And Mrs. King knows some of the dark secrets of Park Lane as the reader discovers them. And as she peels back the layers of the house that she's looking to rob, so she discovers some of those darker secrets as well. And so I think her driving motivation is to make sure that if other people couldn't do anything about it, she will do something about it, and she'll act fast. So that's, that is what I love about Mrs. King, that when all is said and done, her sense of what is right is uppermost in her mind. And actually, I applaud that courage and bravery, and I hope that I myself and others will also act in that way when needs demand. But life can be tough and scary. It can be easier to take an easy path. And actually, I think what Mrs. King is saying is, no, you need to dive in and give the medicine pretty quickly. Otherwise, you'll suffer, and so will others around you.
I loved that. In fact, I was thinking when I was reading that quote, what constitutes carbolic and gauze? Getting caught, being exposed. It was such a great metaphor that you drew there.
Yeah, I think it's action. I think it's taking action to staunch the bleeding. I think it's making sure that you're adding a different chemical to the rot. I think that is what Mrs. King is trying to do. She's a counterforce and a counterpoint to so much. And actually, when you look at this house, if I sort of picture it in my mind's eye and peel open that white stucco marbled facade and look upstairs and downstairs, I can see these shimmering dynamics moving between the floors. And Mrs. King, as we discover, as we read the book, has special privileged knowledge, rights, prerogatives in her mind over every single floor and bit of that house. And so it's her job to move through it like a knife so that she can bring justice and bring restitution where it's required.
You have such a way with words. That was
Oh
beautiful.
gosh, thanks. Oh, thank you.
Kristen, I was thinking the same thing. I said, I love your accent, first of all, but you have a beautiful vocabulary, not just to this book, but in your speaking. You use some very beautiful words. I thought the same
That's
thing.
kind.
Very
Well, that's so
much so.
kind of you. Well, you've asked such good questions. I feel like I have to, do my very best.
I'm just have to unpack Miss DeVries, the
Mm.
character that the reader wanted to hate, but we didn't, because you showed us something deeper within her also. Maybe some past hurts, maybe wrongs done to her, maybe a lack of finding love. But her past didn't justify her mistreatment of others. However, it made her human. It made her likable, almost as the same as what she called the people under the stairs, the wait staff. And Winnie was surprised during the crux of the great heist. Winnie said something so wise. She said, quote, "We're all equals." And we, as the reader, I just had to wonder, might you have been trying to show us something more as the writer, that whether the servant or the served, we are all more the same on the inside than we are different?
Are you in my brain? Yes, I was. Yes, I absolutely was. That's such an acute question. Well, first of all, the character of Mr. Vrees, who I think on page 1 is prowling upstairs in the hushed stillness of the bedroom floor, was in the first draft a fairly straightforward antagonist. She was the young 23-year-old millionaire heiress to this extraordinary house who had fairly mercenary designs, which included trying to arrange her own spectacular and aristocratic marriage, because Mr. Vrees is someone who is incredibly wealthy but loathes her wealth because it's new money, and she feels soiled by it. And she recognizes that the neighbors, whose drawing rooms are completely obliterated by the huge monstrosity of a house that exists next door, which is hers, she knows that the neighbors are looking down on her. And so she was trying to sort of just set up an aristocratic marriage that would put her in a more respectable address around the corner. And she didn't care much about anybody in the house along the way. And interestingly, again, in the course of rewriting the book over and over, I began to peel back her layers, and she became such an interesting and complex person to me. And I began to wonder, what does it take to be someone who's only 23, who's been trained to, within an inch of her life, to be an immaculate, upright, silent, alone person, and who has, in every single inch of her life, constructed and perfected herself. She's trained her voice, she's trained her postures, her manners, everything. And of course, she's trained her feelings as well. And thinking through that compression and self-compression began to really fascinate me. And of course, therefore, I began to feel as though I sensed a tenderness in her, and I felt a tenderness for her too. And trying to unpeel what that would look and feel like set me on a journey of recognizing that actually, at the end of the day and at the end of the book, Mr. Vrees was made of the same human parts as everybody else. And I suppose as the reader moves through the story, I hope what they'll find are characters who begin the book with a certain sense of status, upstairs or downstairs, who are gambling on their futures and their lives. I hope the reader will start to sense those characters flipping their identities like a coin, and see those heads and tails flipping and turning over and over, and realize that some of those, again, dynamics shimmering between the house are putting people on a much more human and complicated level, which has equality at the heart of it. So this is a roundabout way of saying, yes, your question is so right. And that is exactly what I was trying to get to with Mr. Vrees.
I love it so. Thank you.
Alex, there's a quote from Mrs. Bone that I want to read. She experiences envy, and she recognized, I'm going to quote, the low burn, the rage that existed deep in her gut. It was far too easy to get lost in it. Now, most of us, if we're honest, would admit to feeling envy at some point. And in your story, there was a vast difference between the haves and the have-nots, as we've kind of alluded to with the other questions. And envy seemed like almost a natural outgrowth of this kind of a setup with the upstairs and the downstairs. Do you think we're experiencing a similar time now where there's a vast difference between the haves and the have-nots, and that's why maybe this book has such a delicious appeal?
Oh, what another great question. I mean, first of all, I adored writing Mrs. Bone. So as you said at the beginning of our chat, she's a black market entrepreneur. She's made a fabulous fortune through businesses both legitimate and less legitimate, and has a whole smattering of interests all across London. And so the delight was sending Mrs. Bone, who's pretty used to having her own way in every way in life, into that house and being forced to act incognito as the lowliest servant in the entire building. So poor Mrs. Bone, I tortured her from top to toe, making her conduct all sorts of miserable tasks to her great fury. In the course of enjoying that, I also began to think about, why she might begin to feel that green-eyed monster looking around this glorious and splendid house. And I suppose Mrs. Bone is carrying a little bit of myself. I wonder if I might find my own head turned on a mission to rob this beautiful mansion. Might I think that maybe I don't want to share my spoils with everybody else? Could I perhaps keep the lion's share to myself, particularly if I'm investing in the whole enterprise in the background? And I was trying to think through what Mrs. Bone's temptations might be to ruin everything along the way. And so I was thinking with some of the other characters as well. And I think your question is deeper than that, which isn't envy a sort of natural outpace, to steal your phrase, of some of the forces at work in this society. I suppose I'm not a sociological expert, but I will say I can see the reference you're making, which is the turn of the century in London was a real inflection point and changing time, as we sort of move towards the end of the Victorian/Edwardian period, as we feel the Great War shimmering in the future. Our characters, of course, don't know what they're heading towards, but we do. And we can see some of those huge social and economic pressures that were bearing down on them, and can see some of the conflicts that would have created between people with huge, vast privilege and those without. And we know in hindsight that caused huge friction and ruction of all shapes and sizes. So it's not lost on me that at all times in our history, some of those disparities have existed, and certainly they exist now. So I can see the parallels that you are drawing. But I suppose what was uppermost in my mind was this world and this story, and actually setting aside some of those political and economic forces in the background, just the very real human nature of just wanting to have your very best life you can within your own sphere, and thinking through how to make it happen.
Well, you did that, but there was the thrill and the excitement and the entertainment, but also these very deep layers that really you can't help but think about them as you read the story. And to me, that's what makes great fiction, maybe to all of us.
Oh, well, thank you for that. And I have to give you a special thanks as well for mentioning my wonderful Janes. So I did wonder in the course of writing this book and editing this book whether I would get away with having two housemaids with a particularly phenomenal skill at the trapeze who are called Jane 1 and Jane 2. And thank goodness they made it, because they're probably some of my favourite characters. And it's been so, I cannot tell you, so special to see readers really respond and love them too. So thank you for that.
I loved those two Janes. The entire story was so witty and deliciously, wickedly wonderful, because even in today's day and age, as the reader, we have had times in our life where maybe we have been wronged in some way. And in our deepest fantasy, we may plot a beautiful revenge, although we never usually act upon it. But we were able to crawl inside these characters and enjoy every single ounce of it and watch them and sort of become them for a little while. And it was really a lot of fun. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you so much. Thank you for spending time with them and me.
Now, before we let you go, you have to give us a glimpse of what are you working on next?
Oh, I'm delighted to give you a glimpse. So I have been busily writing another novel set in the same world as The Housekeepers, but starring a fresh cast and a new, I hope deliciously dastardly scheme. So let us see. I hope it lands. But yes, writing away always, always, always.
Oh, that sounds, we're going to be rubbing our hands together, waiting for this next one. I cannot wait.
Oh,
And
yay, hooray.
and readers, in the meantime, you're going to want to connect with Alex Hay. You can find him at alexhaybooks.com. He's got a wonderful newsletter there where you get a sneak peek into his writing and publishing. You can also find him on Twitter and Instagram. Alex, thank you so much for joining us from London today. It's been just so much fun talking to you.
Thank you both so much. I have loved it from top to toe.
Us too. Take care.
Take care. Bye for now.
What a fun discussion with Alex. My goodness. That book is a reflection of him from start to finish. Deep, thoughtful, fun, and just what a cool story. What
And
did you Oh, go ahead.
and eloquent. He's so eloquent. And I love his accent. I love all of his beautiful words. And
Yeah.
we had it in the book too, which fit perfectly into this time period of England. And I guess that's one of the reasons we loved it so, right?
Well, that and this theme of revenge. And believe me, I've been kind of wrestling with this very issue. When you feel wronged, right? Your first response is to strike out. Maybe after you think a little while, you think about striking out in maybe a more low key way, but it's on your mind. And that is you want to right that wrong. You want to have justice for yourself. And that was very gripping throughout this story. What do you think?
I thought it was so, I just, it treasured every little thing in the story. And I thought it is so true because things happen to us. And sometimes we'll leave a situation and someone will have said something rude and we'll get home and we'll say, oh, I should have said this in response. We always think of it later. Oh, I wish I would have said that. What if you take it 5 steps further and you say, the next time I see them, I'm not a revenge seeker, but there are people who are. But in our fantasy, we may plot, well, I would love to do this, or I would love to win my own way, or, turn the tables upside down. And we don't really have the opportunity to carry off a grand heist, although maybe we wish we would. But it was so fun to fantasize about it. It really was
Yeah,
fun.
it was, and especially because, it wasn't just a personal vendetta. There were some societal issues that were being exposed by this whole heist unfolding. And that's why I think it was such a cool book because there's that immediate application and then there's kind of the bigger picture of what's going on societally. And, I feel that way about things too. I'm sure you do, where there's things in society that are just wrong and you want to right them and you want revenge when it's turned upside down.
And it's plots and dreams of plots that we very seldom really take on and embrace, thank goodness, because I don't think that's a healthy thing. But this is probably why we love fiction so much. It takes us places that we never could normally go in the real world. I mean, not just locations, but feelings and circumstances and situations. And I really loved every single second of it. Also, I have to say, because we can't give spoilers, but there were a lot of secrets in this book. And I love a story where there's a secret that the reader knows, but all the characters do not know. So it's like we're in on the real motivation of the characters and we're wondering who's going to find out what we know. Alex succeeded in allowing us to almost be the writer along with him because we knew so many secrets.
Oh, I agree. And that's why it's very hard to sometimes summarize a story like this because you want to give away these really, dark little secrets. And there were several, but they all tied together in a way that completely made sense. Some of them I just didn't see coming. So I agree with you. What did you think, by the way, about the have and the have-nots that we were talking about? Because we've talked about, the upstairs people and the downstairs people, or the servers and the served. And, there were so many interesting themes running through this story along those lines.
Well, it's always very interesting and intriguing. And as you can see, we have so many films and Netflix series and that have to do with historic London, historic Britain, where the caste system and the social status is very blatantly clear and highly observed and regulated. And I don't know why this intrigues us so much. I think it's because we still feel those wrongs that were done. And we love to see our characters in those historic times break through in some unusual or, like I had said, creative way. But yes, we still have prejudices today. We may say we don't, but we feel them. A lot of people feel them. And I think a book like this gives everyone hope to persevere and fight back and strive to become who you are meant to be despite downtrodden obstacles and heavy hands. What do you
Yeah.
think?
No, I agree. And I think today, of course, we don't have those formal distinctions, the aristocracy versus the common person, but there is still that feeling of these vast differences economically. And, tapping into that, I think that's where things can sometimes get a little dangerous because people are looking for that revenge or looking to make a statement with a big heist. But that's why the story does go very deep on many levels because it really forces you to kind of think about things from different angles.
It's a lot of fun to plan a grand heist such as this one. And I'm telling you, readers, you've got to pick this up. It's absolutely a joy and a treasure. I just had so much fun reading this. Yeah, it's a great summer read, but it's a great read for all year long. And I want to leave you with a few storm predictions because we have a very busy summer of reads here. We also have Madeline Martin, The Keeper of Hidden Books, Sandra Brown, Out of Nowhere. We have Rebecca Yarros, Iron Flame, Jake Tapper, All the Demons Are Here, Deneen Milner, One Blood, Jacqueline Machard, A Very Inconvenient Scandal, James Rowlands, Tides of Fire, Michael Ledwidge, The Girl in the Vault, John Mars, The Vacation, and more to come.
And listeners, we continue to grow every week. We're so thankful to you. You're sharing our socials, you're listening, you are contacting us about authors you'd like to see, of course, on the show. But we're very thankful to you and, of course, to our authors for joining us for these fantastic discussions. If you want to stay on the radar with us, you can visit us at our website at bookstormpodcast.com. You can also find us on TikTok, on Facebook. We are on Instagram, on Twitter, and of course, YouTube. If you search for Bookstorm and podcast, we should come right up and you can see our authors in person. And of course, till next time, one of the best ways to brave the storm is to dive down deep into life-changing fiction.